Hi, this is David at MASH IT. Now I've had my hands on the M17 for about 3 weeks now. I've really enjoyed gaming on it, so tonight I want to put together a very quick video just testing out 10 decent games at 1080p, 1440p and 4K settings. Now I've done this all through an external 4K 144Hz monitor through the HDMI 2.1 port to give it pretty much the optimal performance through this laptop, and it's running with stock up-to-date Dell drivers in the balance mode. Obviously I could have run it in performance mode, and temperatures would be slightly better and fan noise would be louder, but performance is pretty much essentially the same. Now this is my first time trying a video like this, so if you've got any feedback or if you've got any suggestions, please do pop it in the comment section down below, because I do plan on hopefully doing this for more laptops in the future. But for now, let's get on with the gameplay. So the first game we're going to be testing is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now this is just running the built-in benchmark at 1080p high settings. DLSS is turned off. Now you see straight away that both the 1080p and the 1440p play incredibly well between 90 and 130 frames per second between those two. But when we change it to 4K, we're dropping down to the sort of the 50 frames per second, which me personally, I'm not particularly comfortable with. I like to be playing with usually about 70 to 80 frames per second is my sort of comfort zone. Now as I say, this is 4K high settings. We could drop some of those settings down, or we could use DLSS to get a good frame rate. But this is just to give us a baseline between the three resolutions. Now moving on to Total War Warhammer, again starting at 1080p, ultra settings. You can see we're getting about 100 frames per second. This game is often very CPU limited rather than GPU limited. Switching down to 1440p with between 80 and 100, which is still very, very good depending on the area in the scene. And lastly to 4K, that's usual drop down to the 50 to 60 sort of range. Now in a game like this, I do find this completely playable, and this is the ultra settings, so that you could comfortably turn some of these settings down and get much playable settings at 4K. But again, this is just to show you the difference between the three main resolutions you'll be using. So next we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and we're running 1080p high settings. Starting again with the 1080p, usually about 100 frames per second, which seems to be the sort of the normal with these sort of games. Again, it's the built-in benchmark. No problems, as you see, between all of these demos so far with the heat, but you can see that big drop between 1080p, 1440p and then the 4K, with the 4K being a massive drop off over the 1440p. So of all these three benchmarks we've done so far, you can see the sweet spot realistically is that 1440p resolution, which is why I'm always asking for manufacturers to be using this 1440p high refresh rate panels. Now moving into some Warzone gameplay. Again, starting at the 1080p, very comfortable. This is high settings but with no RTX enabled, and we're getting well over 100 frames per second. Lovely, comfortable, fast experience to be playing on. And then as we drop it down to 1440p, we're getting 80 to 100 frames per second. Again, still very comfortable in my opinion to be playing on. But as we move it down to the 4K settings, that's where things start to become uncomfortable, and I would either be using DLSS to make this more playable, or I would be dropping some of the settings to get this playable. On a shooter like this, realistically, I like about 90 to 100 frames per second is kind of my comfort zone to be playing as sort of a fast-paced shooter. Next, moving on to Age of Empires 4, and with a game like this, anything over 30 frames per second is comfortable for me. Now this is the highest settings at 1080p, you're getting about 100 frames per second. And you can see that the GPU is not even 100% utilised. And then increasing it to 1440p, you can see we've got a much higher GPU utilisation here, and still about 90 to 100 frames per second depending where we are on the map. Again, this is more than comfortable. Anything over 30 for me on a sort of a strategy game is more than comfortable. And lastly, 4K, we got that big drop, 50 to 60 sort of frames per second. Seems to be quite normal across the board with all these games we've been playing. You really are sort of bandwidth limited at 4K, and this is obviously the highest settings. Now, I would still be quite happily playing a game like this at this sort of 50 to 60 frame rate. It's more than comfortable. So this would be perfect for a 4K display, and you won't even be messing with any settings. Okay, so onto Apex Legends at 1080p highest settings. Incredibly comfortable at 1080p. This is quite a well optimized, easy to run game. So this 3070 Ti runs perfectly at the 1080p, usually between 150 and 180 frames per second. A really amazing gameplay experience. You can also see that the temperatures are incredible on this laptop, running this at 1080p. So let's move it up to 1440p and see how it runs. And as you can see, you're dropping to about 110 to about 120 frames per second. Still more than comfortable, I find, on a sort of Twitch shooter. I know some people like as high frames per second as they get, and you could do this by dropping a few settings. In my opinion, this 1440p is the sweet spot. The image quality is fantastic, and it games amazingly still, so you're not going to have any sort of problems gaming at this resolution. And then on to actual 4K. You can see we've got your usual sort of 60 odd frames per second. Now this is okay. You see inside we're up to about 80 frames per second. It's playable. I didn't mind playing at this sort of frame rate, but personally if I was going to be seriously playing with a few friends, I would be changing down to 1440p or knocking down a few settings to get myself up to sort of 90 odd frames per second for some comfortable gameplay. But you know, if you're not overly bothered about having that high frame rate, 4K is more than playable. Now next I was requested War Thunder. This is an incredibly easy game for the actual system to play. Running it at 1080p higher settings, we're looking at 150 to up to about 200 frames per second. Absolutely no problems running this game at all. So let's switch it up to 1440p and see how that handles. So then we go to 1440p and you can see the frame rate is dropping down 100 to about 130. This is still absolutely perfectly playable in my opinion. This is probably what I would be running it at home on my system. I think, you know, the image fidelity you get at 1440p is well worth a few lost frames per second over that 1080p. So let's try it then at 4K. So this shows you how incredibly easy it is to run this game. We're now running at 4K and still getting really high frames per second. Now this map is a little bit easier than the forest map we were running earlier on, but 4K, 140 frames per second is actually pretty incredible. So if you've got, you know, playing some of these older games like War Thunder or maybe something like DOTA or some of these easier esports titles, you can have absolutely no problem running this full pelt at 4K resolution. So back to something a little bit more demanding, we're going to run Halo Infinity now at 1080p, higher settings, and you can see straight away with the big drops in frames over the previous game, we're running at about 100 to 140 frames per second on this bot match. This is teams versus bots. You can see how demanding this is by the fact that the temperatures are now in the 70s. We're getting high GPU utilization and high CPU utilization, and that is sort of bringing the temps up, but still incredibly low temps compared to most Intel systems out there. So switching up to 1440p, you can see a slight drops in frames per second. We're now running between about 110 and 130. So again, still more than playable and certainly an enjoyable experience. So changing up to 4K higher settings, you can see now we're in the sort of 40s to 50 frames per second. I would not be comfortable playing at this resolution on this game. So realistically, you know, you're running a 4K screen, I would be dropping it down to 1440p, or I would be whacking settings right down. So now we're going to be testing DOTA 2, an easier to run esports title, 1080p max settings, and you can see here we're in the sort of 150, 160 frames per second, so incredibly comfortable to play at this resolution. We would be getting slightly higher if we had a dedicated mux switch in this laptop, but unfortunately we are going through the Intel GPU. But let's put it on 1440p and see how that behaves. Bring it up to 1440p, you can see hardly any reduction in frames per second. We're now at about 140, 160 frames per second, so we're only losing a few. Still incredibly comfortable, and again, I would be happily playing on this resolution, higher settings, and enjoying this experience. Let's try 4K. Now moving up to 4K, you can see how light this game is. We're still getting incredibly high frames per second. Looks like almost no difference at all to the actual 1440p. So this certainly is a game you're going to be easily running at 4K on, just like the War Thunder we played earlier on. Next we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, another esports title, quite old now, but people still would like to play this game. Straight away you can see running this dust bot match, we're getting about 200 odd frames per second at 1080p, so could be better if we had that dedicated mux switch, but still more than playable. Moving up to 1440p, that doesn't feel like there's hardly any drop in frames per second at all, which again shows you how light this is. We're probably more CPU bound than we are actually GPU bound at the moment. So again, very comfortable, 1440p, high settings, no problem for this 3070 Ti. And lastly, CSGO at 4K. You can see now we're about 170 to 200 frames per second. Still incredibly comfortable to play on, and you'd certainly be playing CSGO on a 4K screen with no issues with this 3070 Ti. Really is a great experience for these esports titles. So that sort of brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Let me know if there's any sort of suggestions that I can improve these sort of gaming videos in future. You can see straight away from this machine how cool it is running over the Intel counterparts and how well it runs at its, I think, the sweet spot of 1440p. This is my only complaint with Alienware not offering a 1440p panel on these sort of 17-inch gaming laptops. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I just want to say thank you for watching, and please make sure you're subscribed if you want to see more videos like this.